'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking.
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be exploring a fun topic, the philosophy of the Big Bang Theory television show and Joss Whedon with Professor Dean Kowalski. Dr. Dean Kowalski is professor of philosophy at UW-Waukesha in Wisconsin. Welcome to the circle, Dr. Kowalski.
Thank you, Carlos. It's nice to be here.
This is a fun book. I mean, one of my favorite shows on TV is The Big Bang Theory. It's a great show, but it does deal with a lot of philosophical issues. And that's why I found your book so fascinating. Here it is right here, Philosophy and the Big Bang Theory by Dr. Dean Kowalski. You definitely want to get it. I highly encourage it. So what motivated you to write this fun book?
It's kind of a neat story. I was teaching a night class that semester, and it was on Monday nights, and that's when the Big Bang Theory originally was on. And so I would get home, and my wife would say, "You've got to see this show." I said, "Well, I have enough to watch, dear." But she said, no, not only is it funny, but it's also really kind of clever and very intelligently written. So we started watching it together. And, of course, we laughed. I think once I rolled off the couch about the cloning my own Leonard Nimoy napkin bit. It was just, I thought it was just brilliant. But pretty soon it dawned upon me that the show wasn't just about molecules banging together. It was actually about people trying to get along and trying to find meaningful relationships, even though the people involved weren't really anything alike. Penny is nothing like the guys, and even among the main characters, the men main characters, they're quite a bit different as well. And so then it kind of dawned upon me that I think there's a book here. We can talk about friendship and we can talk about ethics. Sheldon is big into the social contract and the roommate agreement and now the girlfriend agreement. What can be said about that? And of course, then there's the philosophy of science that's always there. And so I pitched the book to Wiley Blackwell, and they said, yes, we should do this. And that's kind of how the book got rolling.
And we're all very grateful for it as well. So let's start off with some of these philosophical arguments. I know we're going to dedicate the show to a little bit of the Big Bang Theory show as well as Joss Whedon, which I think he was on that show.
I don't know if he was on the show, but some of his he's referenced all the time because Sheldon was a big fan of Firefly, and as everybody knows, Firefly was the best 13-episode show ever in the history of television. Fox, for some reason, canceled it way before it was time. And so that's kind of a running gag on the show.
That's the one with Nathan Fillion, right?
What's that?
That's the one with Nathan Fillion?
Nathan Fillion. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's
and
go ahead.
In fact, once when Sheldon thinks that Leonard has betrayed him, he ranks right up there with the in the history of the greatest betrayers, Judas and Rupert Murdoch, of course, who canceled Firefly.
He's got a pet peeve versus Rupert.
Yes.
So what are some of the philosophical arguments you did find in this show? I know you mentioned the social contract. If I'm correct, is Jacques Rousseau did that one?
Yeah, and also Hobbes, sure.
Oh, that's right.
But the subtitle of the book is Rock, Paper, Scissors, Aristotle, Locke. And that, of course, is a kind of a play on the game that Sheldon develops. Instead of rock, paper, scissors, he wants to kind of make it much more complicated, add lizard Spock. And the rules, believe it or not, are in the book, very complicated as it turns out. But Aristotle is featured throughout the book. And the first chapter of the book, we have whether or not Aristotle would approve of Sheldon's life. And as it turns out, insofar as Sheldon has the life of the mind, Aristotle would approve, because Aristotle thought that was one of the highest lives that could be led. However, in other ways, it's not clear that Aristotle would approve of Sheldon's life. And this has to do more with the social element. And so Aristotle held that human beings are rational social creatures. And so in some ways, Sheldon does okay with the rational part, but with the social part, he doesn't do nearly as well. And there's a chapter in the book about how Sheldon, has difficulty with friendship. And we already talked about the friendship agreement. But Aristotle believed there were three different kinds of friendship. There was friendship for pleasure, friendship for utility. Those were two of the lower forms, and Aristotle thought those were okay. But the most valuable form of friendship was what he called complete friendship. And here Sheldon has difficulty because he has this hard time kind of connecting with people in sort of deep, meaningful ways where he sees their good as his own good. And so Sheldon does really well with friendship for utility and also friendship for pleasure. There's this hilarious episode where Sheldon is going to befriend Kripke, but only because Kripke has access to some piece of laboratory equipment that Sheldon thinks that he needs. It's one of the funniest episodes of the show. And so what we find time and time again is that there seems to be something deeper to friendship than that Sheldon's heard that. And so another way to kind of think of this is Sheldon often kind of reverts back to what he calls social conventions. And because Sheldon is so empirical and so scientifically minded, he likes to do the math. It's easy for him to see how there are these social conventions. So he understands how it is that when people are troubled, you bring them a hot beverage. And he also can understand how it is that if people form this agreement, then the agreement ought to be honored. However, I think that gets in the way a lot of times of him seeing the deeper connections. And it's not like the other people on the show do that much better. However, he tends to stand out as having probably the most difficult time with that.
Would Aristotle approve of any of the other characters in regards to their relationships, do you think?
I think, as it turns out, I think Aristotle would have a lot to say about Howard and Bernadette, especially insofar as Bernadette really kind of turned Howard's life around. In the early seasons, Howard was a hedonist. He was all about certain bodily pleasures, and the more the better. But over the course of the seasons, as Howard and Bernadette's relationship kind of developed, all of a sudden that Howard is not really on the scene anymore. And so we see Howard kind of developed and progressing into a different sort of character, both a literary character, but also a moral character. And so it's not the case that Penny finds him creepy anymore, maybe a little bit, but not nearly as much as she used to. And so I think that's one way in which I think Aristotle would approve of the relationships on the show.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned Locke. What did Locke play in this show?
Locke has this bit where he wants to say that it's important to think through things and not simply come to beliefs without evidence. And Locke has the most prominent feature in the chapter that touches on religion and science, and has to do then with some of Sheldon's mother's beliefs, because she is the representative of the kind of conservative religious person. And there are lots of funny moments between her and Sheldon about the Bible and about her religion and about praying. And Locke then comes in to say, well, it's one thing to have religious beliefs, or any beliefs really for that matter, but it's another thing altogether to make sure that you have evidence for these beliefs. And so then in the one chapter that features Sheldon's mother, we discuss a little bit about how much evidence there is for religious beliefs, whether or not Sheldon can learn anything from his mother, whether his mother can learn anything from Sheldon. And that then becomes another way how interactions on the show become important. Interesting.
Now, you also wrote a book, you're getting ready to write a book, if I remember correctly, on Joss Whedon.
Yes, it's going to be my second book on Joss Whedon. The first book came out in 2010 called The Philosophy of Joss Whedon. It's another book that I edited. What that book tried to do is, there have been other books on Whedon. There's a cottage industry of Joss Whedon scholars. It's really something else. But what that book tried to do is try to find common themes that are weaved throughout what's called the Whedonverse. And so that includes Buffy and Angel and Firefly and Dollhouse and even the Avengers now. And we tried then to kind of tease out some of these themes that Whedon keeps coming back to. The book that I'm working on now is kind of the successor to that, where I'm going to try to sit down, and it's a single authored book, so I'm the sole author, and I'm trying then to in a distinctive voice try to kind of polish up some of the things that we discovered in the first book.
I can't wait to see that book. What do you think is his fascination with Joss Whedon?
First, I think it's the clever writing, but I also tend to think that right away he tapped into this idea that TV is not only for entertainment, but it's also a medium or a mode for exploring these deeper issues. So early on with Buffy, if you recall, there was, not only did he play upon the high school is hell thing. In fact, that actually was the case for the first couple of seasons of Buffy. But there was a demon for everything. So there was the classic, I have this boyfriend now, and I slept with him, and now he became a completely different guy. And of course, Angel then turns into a vampire. But there were demons for this and demons for that, and it always corresponded with something that was going on with the characters in the show. And I think then what happened is that Whedon kind of refined that. And Whedon then kept going with that, and it seems to me now that Whedon can be considered a philosopher. And this is kind of a new field in aesthetics and philosophy of film, where some filmmakers are not merely producing philosophical works, but they are actually being a philosopher in some sense in producing them. This is kind of rarefied air. I would say maybe Ingmar Bergman. I would say probably Woody Allen. There aren't very many filmmakers that are doing this, but I would like to argue that Whedon's stuff is thoughtful enough that he can be considered among that kind of rare group.
That'd be a big honor. Very big honor for him, that's for sure. So we'll go back to the Big Bang Theory here in the last few minutes. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left here. The ethical issues. There were some ethical issues. We always see them challenged by these amazing ethical issues that Sheldon has to deal with or Leonard has to deal with. Any of those that stood out for you?
The one thing that I do recall is that there was an episode that featured Dennis Kim, and I wish I could recall the name of the episode right now, but Dennis Kim was a very young graduate student. In fact, he was the youngest winner of the Stevenson Award, which is an award given to young physicists, and Sheldon had been the youngest winner, but Dennis Kim had won it. He was 6 months younger than Sheldon, and Sheldon, of course, sees him as a threat, and of course as an adversary. And now Dennis Kim is evil, and he must be put in his place. But as the episode kind of goes on, it seems then that the guys are willing to sidetrack Dennis Kim's career just for the sake of keeping Sheldon quiet. And so here you have this young mind, brilliant, just as brilliant as Sheldon. But what they do is they find him a girlfriend. And so the question becomes, did the guys ruin Dennis Kim's life by helping him along with some of his more social elements of his life, and thereby detracting him from the life of the mind for selfish reasons? Or did they actually do him a favor? It's not really entirely clear how we should view that. And so it seems like you can look at it both ways. And so on the one hand, they help Dennis Kim by kind of emboldening him in the social circles, which what the guys have a hard time with. But on the other hand, they detracted him from his career for selfish reasons, just to get Sheldon off their back. And there's one chapter in the book where we kind of discuss that from a couple different angles, the ethics of whether or not the guys destroyed Dennis Kim's life.
And my last question here, last question before we get to your fastball question.
All right.
Last question is, Amy's been brought in the last couple seasons. We are actually trying to get her on the show as well. what does she do to Sheldon? How does she change that philosophical bent that Sheldon has?
That's a really good question. It seems to me that, and I don't have any proof of this, I don't have an argument just yet, but it seems to me that what Amy is trying to do is Amy is trying to do a similar sort of thing for Sheldon that Bernadette did for Howard. And it seems then that although Amy was willing at first to put up with the girlfriend agreement, it's pretty clear that she wants something more. And a lot of the tension, a lot of the comedy between the two of them have to do with whether or not this accords with the girlfriend or the boyfriend agreement or not. But it seems then that one of the aspects is bringing kind of the social element out in the Sheldon character. Now, to be honest, some of the fans of the show don't really like this very much because they like Sheldon being quirky and idiosyncratic. And so now the show is becoming, in their minds, a little more formulaic. Almost everyone has a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and it's more of a traditional sitcom. But to be perfectly honest, it's difficult to see where else the show could have gone, but to determine how far Sheldon can become, in effect, quote unquote, socialized.
Yeah, they've been on for almost 6 years, I think.
They're in their, is it 8th year?
Excuse me, 8th year? Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
It's really impressive. It reminds me a lot of that show, Frasier. Mm-hmm. Which I think has a lot of philosophical tendencies as well.
It does, actually. It does.
Well, ready for your fastball question?
As ready as I'm going to be.
Is Sheldon, do you think, a Republican or a Democrat?
I want to say that he was probably raised a Republican, but given the fact that he works for the university system in California, he's probably a Democrat.
That's a great answer. You hit that one out of the park for sure.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
So let's start off. I know the argument here, it's kind of all over the internet. We see on autismspeaks.org, they have a Why Our Autism Community Loves Sheldon Cooper. We also see at the Inquisitor, does Sheldon Cooper have Asperger's? And even in the Autism Daily newscast, The Big Bang controversy, is Sheldon Cooper autistic? So it's all over the internet. So what got you even, what made you think about even writing about this chapter in your book? Here's the book, by the way, The Big Bang Theory. What got you interested in that?
Well, there is a view, and it's a common sense one, that it's morally wrong to laugh at people that have a disability. Doing so then is morally inappropriate. But of course, to revel in that seems to make one a moral monster. And clearly, that's at least one of the reasons why people love the Big Bang Theory, because of Sheldon's idiosyncrasies, his peculiarities. However, if it can be argued that his peculiarities are due to a disorder that he has, say Asperger's, for instance, then it seems that people who enjoy the show do so for morally inappropriate reasons. And so then the philosopher in me wants to say, well, should we laugh at the show or not? Are we doing something wrong in enjoying one of our favorite shows?
Can I ask you a quick question? Do you see a connection in any of the ancient philosophers? I know you're a big fan of Plato, but does Aristotle, Plato, any of those guys mention something like this, even though they don't have TV, obviously, but making fun of somebody for their personality traits?
I can't think of anything specific off the top of my head. That's a really good question, Carlos. What I would say, though, is I would just remind everyone that psychology probably starts with Aristotle. Aristotle was one of the first people to really kind of sit down and work through what the word psyche or inner person really amounted to. But I can't think of anything except perhaps kind of tangentially related would be this idea of whether or not you could be wrong about what you truly want, or can you be wrong about what really makes you happy? And both Plato and Aristotle wanted to say that you could be wrong about what made you truly happy, which then I think has some interesting connections to psychology, but then also some connections to the good life and thus philosophy.
That's a good point. Well, let me see if I can try to reach here. I want to try to reach a little bit more. Do you think, is there anything you remember from any of the philosophers, not that there are that many, but any philosophers that talk about hurting someone physically being morally wrong?
Well,
I think Aristotle mentioned something, I can't remember.
Sure, but Kant comes to mind.
Okay.
Kant, of course, was famous for treating people as ends unto themselves. And so whenever you were to treat somebody as a mere means to an end, say if you were to harm them for selfish purposes, the harm could be psychological or physical. If you use that person as a prop or a tool for your selfish ends, then you're using that person inappropriately unless you're doing something morally wrong.
Okay, wow. Okay, so yeah, made my head kind of spin and take a little different route. Now I'm thinking about the producers might be the ones more morally responsible for using a character that reflects those traits.
Right, exactly. Right. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why the show's creators have vehemently denied that Sheldon does have autism or even Asperger's. Maybe that's part of the reason, I'm not sure.
You did a fantastic job in that chapter making sure that people saw that it really probably wasn't autism. Am I correct?
Right. And so the specific author of the chapter is Scott Clifton. Of course, I did get a chance to oversee all the chapters as they came in, and so he and I did collaborate about his chapter. And he and I were agreed that in order for us to make a moral judgment about whether or not it's wrong to laugh at the show, we had to get the facts straight. And so whenever you make any moral judgment, you have to worry about the fact of the matter. You have to worry about whether or not you're using your concepts appropriately. And then you also have to apply a relevant moral principle. And of course, philosophers are keen on moral principles, but we can't overlook the facts or the concepts. And so what Clifton did, to his credit, is he took a very careful look at what the facts of the matter seem to be as they're demonstrated in the show. And he also then reminded us of the conceptual distinction about how to understand a disability. And so what Clifton did then is he found the most recent copy of the DSM. I think it's the 2000 copy. I don't know if there's a newer one.
Yeah, 5 just came out, but he probably didn't have that.
Okay, and he now remember, we're philosophers, we're not physicians, so we can't actually diagnose anybody. But Clifton then said, well, if Sheldon then is going to be diagnosed with Asperger's, then he would have to meet these qualifications, right? He would have to exhibit symptoms that were associated with qualitative impairment of social interaction, restrictive, repetitive, and stereotypical patterns of behavior. And then these symptoms would result in disturbances causing clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, other important areas of functioning. And so then what Clifton did, he was very, very careful about this. And so I can understand how people may be off-put by the fact that he's a philosopher and not a physician or a psychologist. However, he pointed out that in order to qualify under symptoms cluster 1, Sheldon would have to fail to develop appropriate peer relationships, or he would have trouble reading or using physical gestures or social interactions, or he'd have difficulty expressing reciprocal social feelings towards those with whom he interacts, and he would have to show at least 2 of those. And what Clifton does, and it's really kind of enlightening but also funny, I think, is he reminds us that Sheldon has a hard time with sarcasm. He can't read body language. And because of that, remember, there's even an episode where Leonard has to hold up a sign reminding him that this is sarcasm. And so then Clifton thinks that Sheldon does exhibit that one. And of course, he also has a problem with reciprocal social feelings. And Clifton uses the Christmas episode where he's not sure what to get Penny for Christmas because Penny got him something. And so he buys all these different gift baskets of different sizes, and then he'll figure out which one is appropriate based upon what gift Penny actually gives him. As it turns out, it's the DNA of Leonard Nimoy, and he loses it. He doesn't know what to do, so he gives Penny all the baskets. He realizes that even that's not enough, and so he gives Penny a hug, but it is clearly the most awkward hug on the history of television. And so all of that leads Clifton to think that perhaps Sheldon does exhibit some of the symptoms associated with Asperger's. And then he kind of he furthers that, and he talks about how Sheldon also has restrictive, repetitive, stereotypical patterns of behavior, and his knock, knock, knock Penny is probably a classic example. He has to finish the 3 knocks even if Penny's already answered the door. And so there's really no functional reason why he would have to go through all of the knocks. And there are other interesting examples of how Sheldon seems to have these non-functional repetitive behaviors. For instance, on Monday, Penny made him French toast. However, Monday is oatmeal day. And so even though he loves French toast, he throws the French toast away and he makes himself some oatmeal. Clifford thinks that that's not very functional. And he has some of these other examples. And so it seems to be the case that despite what the show creators claim, Sheldon arguably demonstrates symptoms that are associated with Asperger's. Now, of course, in order for him to be diagnosed, he would have to then also, these symptoms would also have to be somehow an impairment. And it would have to be a disability. But of course, what Clifton does, he says, well, that depends upon what we mean by a disability. And there are 2 different ways in which we can understand disability, according to Clifton. And so here what Clifton does is he gets into some of the conceptual considerations of making this moral judgment. If it's wrong to laugh at a person's disability, we have to know what a disability is. And so the first way, the more medical way to understand disability, Clifton explains, is kind of an account of defining what healthy behavior is. And then if you can show how a person's behavior in a certain circumstance is not healthy, then you could say that it's a disability. Some contemporary philosophers have some qualms about this because it seems to suggest that the person intrinsically or inherently is not normal or is kind of subhuman in a way in certain regards. And so because of that, some philosophers want to offer an alternative account, kind of a constructivist account of what a disability is. And there, the environment dictates as much of whether or not the person has a disability as the person's conditions do. Clifton does a really nice job with this. He says, well, look, take a look at Raj. Raj has selective mutism. In America, where it's often the case that young men are trying to woo young women, selective mutism, the kind that Raj has, is arguably disability. However, if Raj was a Buddhist monk who had taken a vow of silence, then this would actually be a benefit to him, not being able to talk to women. And so it really depends upon the environment. Now, on that account, whether or not Sheldon's idiosyncrasies and his peculiarities count as a disability would depend upon his predominant environment. As it turns out, Sheldon has arranged things in such a way where his predominant environment, his idiosyncrasies they enable him to do better work. His attention to detail, his being able to focus in on the minutia, not only of equations, but of course also pop culture, doesn't really matter, but they allow him to focus in on his work. And because he's aligned himself with friends who are willing to put up with his other idiosyncrasies, it seems then that Sheldon remains high functioning. And it seems then that even though he has symptoms that would be traditionally considered akin to Asperger's, they're not a disability. And so Clifton concludes then it seems to follow that we're not morally wrong for laughing at Sheldon because he doesn't actually have a disability. He actually has an ability. A term that Clifton kind of phrases.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it does make it complicated. And there are other diagnoses. I mean, the repetitive tapping on the door, that could be reflective of OCD. Mm-hmm. The one with the food one with the French toast and the oatmeal is kind of funny. I could see my 4-year-old daughter doing that. Nope. I'll take that instead. So yeah, a lot of the things from Sheldon kind of makes me think more of an upbringing kind of issue, more so that he developed some of these habits to provide security of some sort for himself. He looks like he's very not insecure in the sense that we know it as, but more of there's like a fear, there's a high level of anxiety, of uncertainty for him.
There's some of that, sure. But remember, his mother had him tested, so he's not crazy.
That's right. Well, so now we talked a little bit about Asperger's. That's a lighter version of autism. And that was ruled out. Was that ruled out by Clifton in the book?
Whether or not he had Asperger's?
Yeah. I remember ruling out the autism, but...
Yeah, and so Clifton, to his credit, reminds the reader that autism is a spectrum disorder. Right. And so there are degrees of autism, and the more high functioning autistic people tend to be labeled as having Asperger's, and he says right away that if Sheldon does have autism, because Sheldon is relatively independent, even though he doesn't drive and he has to get rides to work from Leonard, he remains autonomous in various respects. And so then if he does have autism at all, it's a very mild case, and so it would have to be Asperger's, if anything.
Okay, so we've eliminated Sheldon Cooper really being diagnosed with autism or Asperger's at the moment, but that still leaves a question. So is the moral of the story, all pun intended, is it moral or not to laugh at a disability?
I think in the end, if a person really does have a disability, it is morally undesirable, if not simply wrong, to laugh at that person simply because he or she has a disability.
I completely agree with you, sir, completely. Once again, if you want to get more information about this, read that chapter and the rest of the chapters. If you're a fan of The Big Bang Theory, you don't want to miss this book. It's called The Big Bang Theory and Philosophy, Rock, Paper, Scissors, Aristotle, Locke by Dean Kowalski, professor of philosophy. But before we let Professor go, he's going to have to deal with the fastball. So, are you ready, sir?
I'm ready.
I don't think anybody's had two fastball questions before. Which philosopher in history, anyone, any time period you want, it's up to you, do you think might have had autism or Asperger's?
Wow. All right. First of all, I don't think I can answer this one. I will say this, is that Immanuel Kant, actually, people were able to set their watch by when he would take his afternoon walk.
Really?
And furthermore, he lived his entire life in the same town, and so he did have certain repetitive behaviors. I suspect not all of them were high functioning, or at least not functional. I suspect some of them were non-functional. And so, off the top of my head, if I had to guess, I would say Immanuel Kant.
It's a fantastic description. Is there a biography about him?
There must be.
Yeah, that'd be a good dissertation project for somebody. Well, thank you once again, Dr. Kowalski, for coming on to the circle. That was fascinating. Once again, Dr. Dean Kowalski, Professor of Philosophy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. Remember, wherever there's psychology involved, even in Sheldon Cooper's world, we are there. See you next time, everyone. And also catch our web TV show, Circle of Insight, on therapycable.com.